The barrel of the rifle pressed cold against Penelope Dawson's temple, and she knew with absolute certainty that her husband was going to pull the trigger this time. She had seen it in his bloodshot eyes when he stumbled through the door of their homestead that September evening in 1884, drunk on whiskey and rage. The drought had taken most of their crops, leaving nothing but dust and desperation across their land outside Enid, Oklahoma territory. Thomas had always been a hard man, but the failing harvest had turned him into something monstrous. Penelope had learned to read the signs over their 3 years of marriage, the way his jaw clenched before his fist flew, the particular slur in his voice that meant she should run. But there was nowhere to run anymore. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and she had become an expert at hiding bruises beneath long sleeves and high collars, at forcing smiles when the preacher's wife asked how she was managing. The shame of it burned hotter than the Oklahoma sun. Good women did not fail at marriage. Good women made their homes into havens, tamed wild men with gentle patience and prayer. At least that was what her mother had told her before she died, what the women at church whispered behind their fans. Penelope was 21 years old and felt ancient with failure. Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. Then his eyes rolled back, and he collapsed onto the rough wooden floor, the rifle clattering from his hands. Penelope stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. He was breathing, just passed out drunk, but she knew this was her only chance. She moved through the house like a woman in a dream, her hands shaking as she gathered what little she could carry. A change of clothes, the few dollars she had hidden in the flour tin, her mother's Bible. She left everything else, including her wedding ring, on the kitchen table. As she saddled their old mare in the barn, she tried not to think about what Thomas would do when he woke and found her gone. Enid was a rough frontier town, barely more than a collection of wooden buildings and tents that had sprung up after the land run of 1893. Penelope had been there only a handful of times, always with Thomas, always under his watchful eye. Now she rode into town alone as the sun set, painting the sky the color of blood and gold. She had no plan beyond escape, no family to turn to, no friends who did not know her as Thomas Dawson's wife. The mare needed rest, and Penelope's legs trembled as she dismounted outside the livery stable. The stable master, an older man with kind eyes, took one look at her face and asked no questions, just told her the boarding fee. She counted out coins with numb fingers, suddenly aware that she had barely enough money for a week, maybe 2 if she ate sparingly. The town's only boarding house stood at the end of the main street, a 2-story structure that leaned slightly to the left. The landlady was a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Carson, who looked Penelope up and down with obvious suspicion. Penelope kept her gaze steady, her chin up, even as shame crawled up her throat. "I need a room," she said, and was proud that her voice did not shake. $3 a week, paid in advance. No men, no drinking, no trouble. Penelope counted out the money, watching her small savings dwindle. Mrs. Carson handed her a key. "2nd floor, last door on the right. Supper's at 6, but you have missed it tonight." The room was barely larger than a closet, containing a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked the dusty street. Penelope sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. Then she washed her face with water from the chipped pitcher, braided her dark blonde hair, and tried to think. She needed work. The problem was that respectable jobs for women were scarce in a frontier town like Enid. She could sew, but that would require fabric and a workspace. She could cook and clean, but taking a position as a domestic servant felt like admitting defeat in a way she could not quite articulate. Pride, she told herself bitterly, was a sin she apparently still possessed. The next morning, Penelope walked the length of Enid's main street, looking for help-wanted signs. The general store did not need anyone. The hotel had no positions available. The saloon owner looked her over with an expression that made her skin crawl and suggested she could make good money entertaining the customers. She left before he could finish explaining what that would entail. By noon, her stomach was cramping with hunger, but she could not bring herself to spend money on food when she had no idea where her next income would come from. She sat on a bench outside the general store, trying to formulate a plan, any plan at all. That was when she first saw Xander Pierce. He rode into town on a paint horse, sitting tall in the saddle with the easy confidence of a man who knew his own capabilities. He was perhaps 25, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore the typical gear of a working cowboy, dusty denim and worn leather, a hat pulled low against the September sun. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance, just another ranch hand coming to town for supplies. But when he dismounted outside the general store and caught her eye, Penelope felt something shift in her chest. His eyes were hazel, flecked with gold, and they held an unexpected gentleness. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. He went into the store, and she told herself to stop staring. She had no business noticing any man, especially not now, especially not when she was still legally married to Thomas Dawson. The afternoon stretched on, hot and dusty. Penelope forced herself to keep moving, to keep looking for work, even though exhaustion was making her lightheaded. She had not eaten since the previous morning, and even then it had only been a piece of bread she had managed to choke down while Thomas raged about the failing crops. The seamstress shop was her last hope. The owner, a stern-faced woman named Miss Harriet, looked at Penelope's trembling hands and drawn face. "Can you sew a straight seam?" "Yes, madam. My mother taught me." "I cannot pay much. 10 cents for a finished shirt, 15 for trousers." It was barely enough to survive on, but Penelope nodded eagerly. "I will take it, thank you." Miss Harriet handed her a bundle of cut fabric. "Bring these back finished by Friday. If the work is good, I will have more." Penelope clutched the bundle like a lifeline. 3 days to sew 4 shirts. If she worked through the nights, if she did not sleep, she could earn 40 cents. It was not enough for another week's rent, not enough for food, but it was something. She carried the fabric back to her room and immediately set to work. Her fingers were clumsy at first from hunger and nerves, but muscle memory took over. The needle flashed in the lamplight as she sewed, her stitches small, and even the way her mother had taught her. She worked until her eyes burned and her back ached, until the lamp oil ran low and she was sewing by the last flickering light. When she finally lay down to sleep, her mind would not quiet. She thought about Thomas waking up, discovering her gone. Would he come looking for her? The idea sent ice through her veins. Enid was not far enough away. Maybe nowhere was far enough away. She thought about the money she did not have, about the food she could not afford to buy. Her stomach cramped again, and she pressed her hand against her belly, trying to quiet the sensation. The next day, she skipped breakfast at the boarding house, claiming she was not hungry when Mrs. Carson gave her a suspicious look. She spent the entire day in her room, sewing until her fingers bled, stopping only when she had to, her vision swimming. By the second evening, she was so lightheaded she had to grip the windowsill to stay upright. The room tilted around her, and she realized dimly that she was going to faint. She managed to sit down on the bed before darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. When she woke, it was dark outside and someone was knocking on her door. Penelope struggled to her feet, disoriented and dizzy. "Miss Dawson," it was Mrs. Carson's sharp voice. "You have a visitor." Fear jolted through her. Thomas, he had found her. She opened the door with shaking hands, already preparing to run, but it was not her husband standing in the hallway. It was the cowboy from the general store, Xander Pierce, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Madam," he said quietly, "I hope I am not intruding. Mrs. Carson said you have been missing meals." Penelope stared at him, confusion warring with mortification. "I do not understand." Xander shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable. "I noticed you in town yesterday. You looked like you could use a good meal, and I thought." He held out the basket. "It is just some stew and bread from the hotel restaurant. Nothing fancy." Shame burned through her, hot and terrible. She wanted to refuse, to tell him she did not need charity, that she was managing just fine. But the smell of the food was making her dizzy all over again, and she could not quite form the words to send him away. "Why?" she finally asked. "Because you looked like you needed help," he said simply. "And I know what it is like to be too proud to ask for it." Something in his voice, in the way he said it without judgment, broke through her defenses. She took the basket with trembling hands. "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Good night, madam." Penelope closed the door and set the basket on the small table near the window. When she lifted the cloth, she found not just stew and bread, but also an apple, a hunk of cheese, and a small jar of honey. Tears blurred her vision as she ate, the food settling in her empty stomach like a blessing. She tried to tell herself it was just kindness, that it meant nothing, that she should not read anything into a simple gesture from a stranger. But as she finished the meal and returned to her sewing with renewed energy, she could not quite banish the memory of those hazel eyes and the quiet understanding in them. The next morning, Penelope woke with renewed determination. She finished the last 2 shirts by midday and brought them to Miss Harriet, who examined each seam with critical attention before nodding her approval. "These will do. Here is your pay, and here is more work if you want it." Penelope took the coins and the new bundle of fabric, relief flooding through her. It still was not enough, but it was progress. When she stepped out of the seamstress shop, she nearly collided with Xander Pierce. He caught her elbow to steady her, and she felt the warmth of his hand through her sleeve. "Sorry, madam. Are you all right?" "Yes, I am fine. Thank you for." She hesitated, not sure how to acknowledge the previous evening without embarrassing them both. "For your kindness." "It was nothing." He glanced at the bundle in her arms. "Are you working for Miss Harriet?" "Yes, sewing piecework." Something flickered in his eyes, an expression she could not quite read. "That is hard work for little pay." She lifted her chin. "It is honest work, and I am grateful for it." "I did not mean to suggest otherwise." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I work at the Double P Ranch about 8 miles north of town. We are short on help in the house. The foreman's wife, Mrs. Patterson, has been looking for someone to help with cooking and mending. It would pay $2 a week plus room and board." Penelope's heart leaped, but she forced herself to think carefully. "Why would you tell me this?" "Because you seem like someone who could use a fair chance." His gaze was steady, honest. "And because Mrs. Patterson is a good woman who would treat you right." "I do not even know your name." "Xander Pierce. And you are Miss Dawson, according to Mrs. Carson." She noticed he said Miss, not Mrs., and wondered what the landlady had told him. "Penelope, Miss Penelope." He touched the brim of his hat. "If you are interested in the job, I ride back to the ranch tomorrow morning. You are welcome to come along, meet Mrs. Patterson, and see if it suits you." She should have said no. She should have been more cautious, should have asked more questions. But something in her gut said this man could be trusted, and her options were rapidly running out. "What time do you leave?" 7 o'clock from the livery stable. "I will be there." That night, Penelope lay awake, second-guessing her decision. What did she really know about Xander Pierce? What if this was a mistake? What if Thomas tracked her to the ranch? But staying in town meant she would run out of money within days, and then what? The saloon owner's leering face flashed through her mind, and she shuddered. No, the ranch was her best option, maybe her only option. She was at the livery stable at 6:30 the next morning, her few possessions packed into a worn carpet bag. Xander arrived promptly at 7, leading his paint horse and a gentle-looking chestnut mare. "This is Rosie," he said, handing her the reins. "She is calm and steady. Do you ride?" "Yes, though it has been a while since I had a good horse." They rode out of Enid as the sun climbed higher, painting the Oklahoma landscape in shades of gold and amber. The land stretched out flat and endless, dotted with scrub brush and the occasional twisted tree. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way. Xander did not push for conversation, seeming content to ride in companionable silence. But eventually, curiosity got the better of Penelope. "How long have you worked at the Double P?" "3 years, give or take." "I started as a regular hand, but Mr. Patterson promoted me to head wrangler last year. You must be good at what you do." "I know horses." He said it matter-of-factly, without boasting. "They are more honest than most people." She could not argue with that. "What is Mr. Patterson like?" "Fair, firm but fair. He expects a full day's work for a full day's pay, but he does not cheat his workers or treat them poorly. His wife is the same way. And they will not mind you bringing a stranger to their door." Xander glanced at her, and she saw understanding in his eyes. "I sent a message with one of the other hands yesterday. Mrs. Patterson is expecting you." Penelope felt something loosen in her chest. He had thought ahead, had made sure she would not be walking into an uncomfortable situation. It was such a small thing, but it spoke of a consideration she was not used to receiving. The Double P Ranch came into view just before noon, a sprawling collection of buildings clustered around a main ranch house. Cattle grazed in distant pastures, and Penelope could see several men working with horses in a large corral. It looked prosperous and well-maintained, a stark contrast to the failing homestead she had fled. A woman emerged from the ranch house as they approached, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 40, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun and a kind, weathered face. "You must be Penelope," she said warmly. "I am Alice Patterson. Xander tells me you are looking for work." "Yes, madam, I can cook and clean, and I am good with a needle." "Well, the Lord knows I could use the help. Come inside and let us talk properly." Penelope dismounted and followed Mrs. Patterson into the ranch house, acutely aware of Xander watching her go. The interior was spacious and clean, with simple but sturdy furniture and curtains that let in the afternoon light. It felt like a real home, lived in and loved. Mrs. Patterson gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table and poured 2 cups of coffee. "Xander said you were in a difficult situation." "I will not pry into your personal business, but I need to know you are reliable and hard-working." "I am both, madam. I promise you that." The older woman studied her for a long moment. "I believe you. The job is 6 days a week, Sundays off for church if you are inclined. You would help with cooking, cleaning, mending, and whatever else needs doing around the house. Room and board included, plus $2 a week. Does that suit you?" "Yes, madam, very much." "Then you are hired. I will show you to your room and you can start tomorrow. Give yourself today to settle in." The room Mrs. Patterson showed her to was small but comfortable, with a real bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the eastern pasture. It was more than Penelope had dared to hope for. She set down her carpet bag and sat on the edge of the bed, overwhelmed by a sudden wave of emotion. She had done it. She had escaped Thomas, found work, found a place where she might actually be safe. It did not erase the shame of her failed marriage or the fear that still woke her in the night, but it was a start. That evening, she ate supper with the Pattersons and the ranch hands in the big dining room off the kitchen. It was a boisterous affair, with men joking and talking over each other, passing bowls of beef stew and fresh bread. Xander sat across from her, and she caught him watching her a few times with an expression she could not quite decipher. After supper, she helped Mrs. Patterson with the dishes, falling into an easy rhythm with the older woman. Mrs. Patterson was a talker, filling Penelope in on the various personalities of the ranch hands, the quirks of ranch life, the challenges of managing a household so far from town. "Xander is a good man," Mrs. Patterson said casually, scrubbing a pot. "Quiet but good. He does not talk much about where he came from, but I get the sense he has known hardship." Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "He has been very kind to me." "Yes, well, he has a way of noticing when people are struggling. Last winter, we had a hand whose little boy took sick. Xander rode through a snowstorm to fetch the doctor, then refused to take any credit for it." Mrs. Patterson dried the pot and set it aside. "I am glad he brought you here, Penelope. You look like you could use some peace and safety." Tears stung Penelope's eyes. "Thank you, madam." The older woman patted her shoulder. "Call me Alice, and you do not have to thank me. Just do your work and heal whatever wounds brought you here." Over the following weeks, Penelope settled into ranch life with a sense of relief so profound, it sometimes took her breath away. She woke before dawn to help Alice prepare breakfast for the hands, spent her days cooking and cleaning and mending, and fell into bed exhausted but satisfied. It was hard work, but it was honest and safe, and no one raised a hand to her or looked at her with cruelty. She saw Xander often, of course. He was the head wrangler, which meant he was usually working with the horses or overseeing the other hands. Sometimes he came into the kitchen for a cup of coffee, and they would exchange a few words. Nothing significant, nothing that could be construed as improper, but Penelope found herself looking forward to those brief moments. He never asked about her past, never pushed her for information she was not ready to give. But his presence was steady and reassuring, a quiet strength that made her feel less alone. One afternoon in October, Penelope was in the garden behind the ranch house, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the first frost. It was peaceful work, and she was humming to herself when she heard footsteps behind her. "You have a pretty voice," Xander said. She turned, startled. He was standing at the edge of the garden, his hat in his hands, looking almost nervous. "I did not mean to startle you," he said quickly. "I just finished with the horses and saw you out here. It is all right." She brushed dirt from her hands and stood. "Was there something you needed?" "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were settling in all right." "I am. Alice is wonderful and the work suits me." "Good. That is good." He fell silent, turning his hat in his hands. Then, as if gathering his courage, he said, "Would you like to take a walk with me this evening?" "After supper. There is a place by the creek that is real pretty at sunset." Penelope's heart hammered in her chest. She knew what he was really asking, knew that accepting would be crossing a line from employer and employee, from acquaintances to something more. She should say no. She was still married to Thomas, even if she never intended to return to him. It would be wrong, maybe even dangerous, to encourage Xander's attention. But when she looked into his eyes and saw the hope and vulnerability there, she could not bring herself to refuse. "I would like that," she said softly. His smile was like sunrise. "I will come find you after supper then." Penelope spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation. She told herself it was just a walk, that it did not have to mean anything, but her heart knew better. When she changed into her better dress after supper and pinned up her hair with extra care, Alice gave her a knowing smile but said nothing. Xander was waiting by the barn, freshly washed and wearing a clean shirt. They walked in silence at first, following a worn path that led away from the ranch buildings toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked the creek. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of grass and water and approaching autumn. The creek was indeed beautiful, a ribbon of silver reflecting the orange and pink sky. They stood on the bank, watching the water flow past, and Penelope felt a peace settle over her that she had not known in years. "Thank you for bringing me here," she said. "Thank you for coming." Xander hesitated, then added, "I have been wanting to talk to you properly for weeks now, but I did not want to overstep." "Talk to me about what?" "About why you came to Enid alone, about what you were running from." He held up a hand when she stiffened. "You do not have to tell me if you do not want to, but I want you to know that I see you, Penelope. I see someone strong and brave who is trying to build a new life, and I want to help if you will let me." The kindness in his voice undid her. Before she could stop herself, the whole story came tumbling out. Thomas and his drunken rages, the rifle pressed to her temple, her desperate flight to Enid. The shame of failing at marriage, the fear that he would find her, the crushing weight of trying to survive alone with no money and no prospects. Xander listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker as she spoke. When she finally fell silent, he turned to face her fully. "You did not fail at anything," he said fiercely. "He failed you. A man who raises his hand to his wife is no man at all, just a coward and a bully. The law says I am still his wife, that I owe him obedience. The law is wrong." Xander took a step closer, his eyes blazing. "You do not owe him anything, Penelope. Not your obedience, not your life, nothing." She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept the absolution he was offering, but the shame ran too deep. "I should have been stronger, should have been able to make the marriage work." "No." Xander reached out, then seemed to think better of it, his hand dropping back to his side. "You were strong. You survived. You got out. That took more courage than most people have." Tears spilled down her cheeks, and suddenly Xander's arms were around her, holding her close. She should pull away, should maintain propriety, but she was so tired of being alone and afraid. She let herself lean into his strength, let herself accept the comfort he was offering. "I am going to keep you safe," he murmured into her hair. "I promise you that. If Thomas Dawson shows his face here, he will regret it." She believed him. And that terrified her almost as much as Thomas had, because it meant opening her heart again, trusting again, risking again. But as they stood by the creek in the fading light, Penelope realized that some risks were worth taking. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. Xander found excuses to be near her, to help with chores that brought them into proximity. They stole moments together whenever they could, walking by the creek in the evenings, sitting together on the porch after the others had gone to bed, talking about everything and nothing. Penelope learned that Xander had grown up in Texas, the youngest son of a rancher who drank away the family fortune. He had left home at 16 and spent years drifting from ranch to ranch, learning his trade, before landing at the Double P. He was 26 years old, and he had never met a woman who made him want to stay in one place until now. "I used to think I was not the settling down type," he told her one night, their shoulders touching as they sat on the porch steps. "But then I saw you sitting outside the general store, looking so lost and so strong at the same time, and something just clicked." "I was a mess," she protested. "You were beautiful." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "You still are." She wanted to kiss him then, wanted it with an intensity that scared her. But she was still legally married, still tied to Thomas Dawson by laws and vows that felt like chains. "I cannot," she whispered. "As much as I want to, I cannot." Xander's jaw tightened, but he nodded. I know. But I can wait. However long it takes, I can wait. In November, the first real frost came, and with it, devastating news. One of the hands came back from town with gossip from the saloon. Thomas Dawson's homestead had burned to the ground, and Thomas had died in the fire. The townspeople speculated he had been drunk and knocked over a lamp. Penelope received the news in the kitchen, her hands frozen over the bread dough she was kneading. Alice put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I am sorry for your loss," she said quietly, but Penelope did not feel loss. She felt a confusing tangle of relief and guilt, and something that might have been grief for the man Thomas could have been, should have been. She excused herself and walked out to the barn, needing space to breathe, to think. Xander found her there, sitting in an empty stall, her arms wrapped around her knees. "I heard," he said, sitting down beside her. "I should feel sadder. What kind of person does that make me? A human one." He reached over and took her hand. "You are allowed to feel relieved. You are allowed to be glad that you are finally free. Free." The word echoed in her mind like a bell. She was free. Free of Thomas, free of the fear, free to make her own choices, free to love Xander Pierce. She turned to him, and whatever he saw in her face made his breath catch. "Penelope." She kissed him then, pouring 3 months of longing and hope and desperate affection into the press of her lips against his. He responded with a reverence that made her heart ache, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and breakable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Xander rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know you need time, but I need you to know that I want forever with you. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, marry me." "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, I will marry you." They were married on a cold December day in the small church in Enid, with Alice and Mr. Patterson standing as witnesses. Penelope wore a simple blue dress that Alice had helped her make, and Xander wore his best suit, his hair freshly cut, and his eyes shining with joy. The ceremony was brief, the vows traditional, but when Xander slipped a gold band onto her finger and kissed her as her husband, Penelope felt something inside her heal. This was what marriage was supposed to be, this partnership and tenderness and mutual respect. They moved into a small cabin on the edge of the Double P property, one that Mr. Patterson had offered them at a reduced rent. It was cozy and warm, with a stone fireplace and a bedroom loft that overlooked the main room. Xander filled it with furniture he built himself, sturdy pieces that were made with love and care. Their first winter together was hard in practical terms, the Oklahoma cold seeping through the cabin walls, the work at the ranch never ending. But Penelope had never been happier. She woke each morning beside a man who loved her, who spoke to her with kindness, who touched her with gentleness. She learned what it meant to be a partner instead of a possession, to have her opinions valued and her presence cherished. In the spring, they discovered she was pregnant. Xander was elated, but Penelope felt fear creep back in. What if she was a terrible mother? What if the baby reminded her of Thomas, of those dark years? But Xander held her through the fear, reminded her that their child would be a product of love, not violence. And as her belly grew round with life, Penelope found herself believing him. Their son was born in September of 1885, exactly 1 year after Penelope had fled her old life. They named him James, after Xander's father, a man who, despite his flaws, had taught his son the value of hard work and integrity. James had Xander's dark hair and Penelope's blue eyes, and from the moment the midwife placed him in her arms, Penelope felt her heart expand in ways she had not thought possible. Xander was a devoted father, rising in the night to help with feedings, singing lullabies in a surprisingly sweet voice, carrying James around the ranch in a sling so Penelope could rest. Watching him with their son made Penelope fall in love with him all over again. The years rolled forward, marked by the changing seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. James learned to walk, then to talk, then to ride a horse with his father's patient instruction. Mr. Patterson promoted Xander to foreman when the previous one retired, and with the raise in pay, they were able to buy their cabin outright and add on a proper kitchen and a second bedroom. In 1888, their daughter was born, a tiny fierce thing they named Sarah. She had Penelope's determination and Xander's stubbornness, and she kept them all on their toes. James adored his little sister, appointing himself her protector and playmate. Penelope sometimes thought about her old life, about the girl she had been when she rode into Enid with nothing but fear and desperation driving her forward. That girl felt like a stranger now, someone from a story she had once heard. She had been reshaped by love and safety, by the consistent kindness of a good man, and the purpose of building a family. She thought about shame too, about how it had nearly destroyed her. She had been too ashamed to ask for help, too ashamed to admit her marriage was a disaster, too ashamed to accept charity when she desperately needed it. But Xander had seen past the shame to the person underneath, had offered help without judgment, had shown up with exactly what she needed even when she could not bring herself to ask. One evening in the summer of 1890, they sat together on the porch of their cabin, watching James and Sarah chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Xander had his arm around her shoulders, and Penelope leaned into his warmth, contentment settling over her like a blanket. "You ever regret it?" she asked. Taking a chance on a desperate woman outside a general store, Xander pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Not for a single second. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope Pierce. You saved my life, you know. I was drowning and I was too proud to admit it." "You saved your own life," he corrected gently. "You were the one who got out, who kept going even when it was hard. I just made sure you had a soft place to land." She turned to kiss him properly, tasting love and home and forever in the press of his lips. When they broke apart, Sarah was tugging on Xander's sleeve, demanding to be lifted up to see the stars. He scooped her up with a laugh, pointing out constellations while James climbed into Penelope's lap. This was what she had been searching for all along, Penelope realized. Not a perfect life without struggles or hardship, but a life built on love and respect and partnership. A life where she was valued and cherished, where her children grew up seeing what a real marriage looked like. The shame that had once consumed her felt distant now, a shadow that no longer had power over her. She had learned that asking for help was not weakness but wisdom, that accepting kindness was not failure but grace. And she had learned that sometimes the best things in life came from the darkest moments, if you were brave enough to keep walking forward. As the stars came out and the children's laughter echoed across the prairie, Penelope sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the cowboy who had seen her, really seen her, when she needed it most. For the man who had shown up with everything she needed, even when she had been too ashamed to ask. Years continued to unfold with their particular mix of joy and challenge. The Double P Ranch prospered under Mr. Patterson's management and Xander's careful oversight of the livestock operations. Penelope became known throughout the area as an excellent seamstress, taking in work from families in Enid and the surrounding homesteads. The extra income allowed them to save for the children's future, to dream of sending James to school back east if he wanted it, to ensure Sarah would have a dowry when she came of age. In 1892, tragedy struck when Mr. Patterson died suddenly of a heart ailment. Alice was devastated, and Penelope spent weeks helping her manage the grief and the practical details of settling the estate. When the will was read, everyone was surprised to learn that Mr. Patterson had left the ranch not to his distant cousins back in Kansas, but to Alice, with the stipulation that Xander would inherit it upon her death if he remained as foreman. It was an extraordinary gesture of trust and respect, and Xander took the responsibility seriously. He worked harder than ever, determined to honor Mr. Patterson's legacy and ensure the ranch continued to thrive. Alice remained in the main house, but relied heavily on Xander's judgment, gradually ceding more control to him as the years passed. The town of Enid grew and changed around them. More families arrived, drawn by the promise of available land and opportunity. A proper schoolhouse was built, and both James and Sarah attended when they were old enough, learning reading and arithmetic and history. Penelope volunteered to help the teacher with younger students, discovering she had a talent for patience and instruction. But not everything was smooth. In 1893, a group of men rode onto the Double P property, claiming that some of the ranch land had been improperly registered during the land run and rightfully belonged to them. It was a tense few months, with lawyers brought in from Oklahoma City and surveys conducted and tempers running high. Xander handled it with characteristic steadiness, presenting documentation and standing his ground without resorting to violence. In the end, the court ruled in favor of the ranch, but the incident reminded them all how fragile their prosperity was, how quickly things could change. Through it all, Xander and Penelope's marriage remained a source of strength for both of them. They had built something rare, a partnership based on genuine affection and mutual support. They still took walks by the creek when they could steal the time, still talked late into the night about their hopes and fears, still touched each other with the tenderness of new love even after years together. In 1895, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. It was unexpected, as Sarah was already 7 years old, and Penelope had assumed her childbearing years were behind her. But at 32, she found herself once more experiencing the strange alchemy of growing a new life. This pregnancy was harder than the previous two. She was older, more tired, and there were complications that had the midwife shaking her head with concern. Xander hovered anxiously, bringing her endless cups of tea and reading to her from the newspaper when she was confined to bed rest. Their second daughter was born in February of 1896, a cold month that kept everyone huddled close to the fireplace. The labor was long and difficult, and there was a moment when Penelope thought she might not survive it. But she fought her way through, driven by the knowledge that Xander and her children needed her, that she had too much to live for to give up now. They named the baby Catherine, and she was the image of her father, with dark hair and hazel eyes that seemed to see everything. James, now 10, was fascinated by his new sister. Sarah was less impressed, having enjoyed being the baby of the family, but eventually came around. The years settled into a comfortable rhythm. James showed an aptitude for working with horses that reminded Penelope achingly of Xander. Sarah proved to be academically inclined, devouring every book she could get her hands on and pestering the schoolteacher with questions. Catherine was still too young to show her particular talents, but she was a happy baby who laughed easily and slept through the night. In 1898, Alice Patterson died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 63. It was not unexpected, as her health had been declining, but it still hit them all hard. She had been a mother figure to Penelope, a mentor and friend, and her loss left a hole in their lives. According to Mr. Patterson's will, the ranch passed to Xander. It was overwhelming and humbling to suddenly own the land they had worked for so many years. Xander sat at the kitchen table, turning over the deed in his hands, looking stunned. "I never imagined," he said quietly. "When I was a kid in Texas, working for pennies and sleeping in the barn, I never imagined owning anything like this." Penelope put her hand over his. "You earned it, through hard work and integrity and loyalty. Mr. Patterson saw that. Alice saw that. We earned it," he corrected. "This is ours, Penelope. Yours and mine and our children's." They renamed it the Pierce Ranch, though most locals continued calling it the Double P out of habit. Xander hired more hands and expanded the cattle operation, buying additional grazing land when it became available. Penelope oversaw the household, managing not just their family but the various ranch hands who came and went, ensuring everyone was fed and clothed and treated fairly. They became pillars of the community, known for their fairness and generosity. When a neighbor's barn burned down, Xander organized a work party to rebuild it. When a widow in town could not afford to keep her home, Penelope hired her to do laundry for the ranch. They tithed to the church, supported the school, and treated their employees with respect and decent wages. The children grew, as children do. James turned 18 in 1903 and announced his intention to study veterinary medicine. It was a bold choice, requiring him to travel to college in Kansas, but Xander and Penelope supported him wholeheartedly. Sarah, at 15, was already talking about becoming a teacher. Catherine, at 7, was still discovering the world with wide-eyed wonder. On a warm evening in September of 1904, exactly 20 years after Penelope had ridden into Enid with nothing but fear and desperation, she and Xander sat together on the porch of their home. It was a much larger house now, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, with a proper parlor and separate bedrooms, and even indoor plumbing that Xander had installed 2 years prior. The sunset painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, and in the distance, they could see cattle grazing peacefully. Somewhere inside, Catherine was practicing piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. Sarah was reading in her room and James was away at college, his latest letter tucked safely in Penelope's apron pocket. 20 years, Penelope said softly. "Can you believe it?" Xander reached over and took her hand, his thumb tracing familiar patterns on her skin. "Best 20 years of my life. Mine, too." She leaned her head on his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, horse and leather and home. "Do you remember that first day, when you brought me food at the boarding house? I remember thinking you were the bravest person I had ever met. Sitting there with your head up, even though you were clearly terrified and starving. I was so ashamed. I did not want anyone to know I was struggling. I know, but I am glad I saw it anyway, glad I had the courage to help." Penelope lifted her head to look at him properly. The years had added lines to his face and silver to his hair, but his eyes were the same, warm and steady and full of love. "You gave me everything," she said. "A home, a family, a life worth living. I do not know how to thank you for that. You do not have to thank me." Xander cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle. "Loving you has been the greatest privilege of my life. Watching you bloom and grow strong, seeing you become the woman you were always meant to be, raising our children together. It is more than I ever hoped for." She kissed him then, a long, slow kiss that held 20 years of partnership and passion and deep, abiding affection. When they broke apart, both were smiling. "Do you think we will have grandchildren someday?" Penelope asked. "I would bet money on it." "James has been writing about a girl in his letters, did you notice?" "I did. And Sarah has half the boys in the county mooning after her, though she pretends not to notice. She gets that from her mother. You had me mooning after you from the first moment, and you did not notice for weeks." Penelope laughed. "I noticed. I was just too scared to acknowledge it." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the clouds in ever-deepening shades of crimson. The piano music stopped, and Catherine came running out to throw herself into Xander's arms, chattering about something that had happened at school. Xander listened with patient attention, asking questions and making her giggle. Watching them, Penelope felt her heart swell with gratitude so profound it was almost painful. She thought about the girl she had been, desperate and ashamed, convinced she had failed at the most basic tasks of womanhood. She thought about the moment when Xander had appeared with that basket of food, seeing her need even when she could not voice it, offering help without judgment or expectation. That one act of kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. It had given her the strength to keep going, to accept help, to open her heart to the possibility of love again. And from that small seed had grown this entire life, this family, this legacy they were building together. She had learned so many things over the years. That strength was not the absence of struggle, but the ability to keep moving forward despite it. That asking for help was not weakness but wisdom. That love was not about perfection but about choosing each other, day after day, through all the challenges and joys that life brought. Most importantly, she had learned that shame was a liar. It had told her she was broken beyond repair, that she deserved the abuse, that she had failed. But Xander had shown her a different truth, that she was worthy of love and respect, that her value was inherent and unchanging, that she deserved happiness. As darkness fell, and Xander carried a sleepy Catherine inside, Penelope took one last look at the land stretching out before her. This was home. Not just the physical place, but the sense of belonging and safety and love that permeated every corner of it. She had been too ashamed to ask for help, but the cowboy had seen it anyway. He had shown up with everything she needed, not just that first night with the basket of food, but every day since. With his steady presence, his unwavering support, his deep and abiding love, and she had given him everything in return. Her heart, her trust, her partnership in building this life together. They had saved each other, really, in all the ways that mattered. Penelope followed her family inside, closing the door on the prairie night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, the endless work of maintaining a ranch and raising children and being part of a community. But tonight, she was simply grateful. Grateful for the man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had helped her when she could not ask, who had loved her when she thought she was unlovable. Their story had started with shame and fear and desperation. But it had become something beautiful, something lasting, something worth celebrating. And as Penelope climbed the stairs to tuck Catherine into bed, she knew with absolute certainty that she would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought her here. This was her happily ever after, earned through courage and kindness, built on a foundation of genuine love and mutual respect. And it was more than she had ever dared to dream possible on that dusty September day when she rode into Enid with nothing but hope and determination to survive. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges, more joys. James would indeed marry his college sweetheart and give them grandchildren. Sarah would become a teacher and open a school for girls. Catherine would grow up to be a gifted artist whose paintings captured the beauty of the Oklahoma landscape. But all of that was still to come. For now, in this perfect moment, Penelope Pierce was simply happy. And that was everything.